And I want to just kick off our conversation with this tweet that we saw earlier today from President Trump saying, quote, "I am allowing Japan and South Korea to buy a substantially increased amount of highly sophisticated military equipment from the United States." Is that the step in the right direction here in dealing with North Korea?
Well, I think it's a very logical step. The North Korean threat has become very palpable, and the North Korean leader has become, has become very clear about his willingness to develop modern weaponry and try to use them as deterrent as well as perhaps on as a mode of attack. So I think it's very logical that South Koreans would be, and the Japanese would be, stepping up their military capability, and of course we're very pleased to have the opportunity to sell them some of our good equipment.
Well, certainly there is an opportunity here, business opportunity, I guess you could say, Tom. But it's a logical step. But isn't it a step that brings us closer, though, to military conflict, which is not what anybody wants?
I think a lot of strategic theorists would argue that the best way to avoid military conflict is to be prepared for it. Deterrence plays a very important role in our alliances in Asia. Right. The U.S. plays a very large role in that, but we also expect our allies to do their part, and I think this is part of that.
We had a former Senator Max Baucus on with us yesterday, who is also, of course, the former ambassador to China. And I want to just play for you one part of, you mentioned the allies, right? I want to play for you part of his comment about China and their role here in this whole dynamic.
Our requests of China are embarrassingly superficial, in my judgment. We've got to get past that. Now the chicken's coming home to roost, the rubber's meeting the road, and we got to get real. The bluster's not working, so let's just sit down, do the hard work, which is behind-the-scenes negotiation and developing contacts with lots of appropriate folks in China, so we can start finding some solutions. We're talking here about U.S.-South Korean relations, but we know China plays such a vital role here. What do you think the U.S. and South Korea could do to pressure China to do more?
Well, first, let me say that I agree very much with what Senator Baucus just said. I think we need to continue to press China to impose sanctions on North Korea, but at the same time, we need to be more creative. In the final analysis, if we're not going to go to war, and if we're not going to accept North Korea as a long-term nuclear power, we need to get back to the negotiating table. And I believe we should be talking to the Chinese about how we can work together to get back to a negotiating table in which we can resolve this issue peacefully.
Isn't it the case that, as you say, let's be frank at where we're at. You've got many phone calls between world leaders and not a lot of consensus. Further sanctions are not likely to do very much because we know that China is not likely to fully play ball, particularly when it comes to cutting off energy to the north. What's left? Because it feels like we've been here many times before where they've crossed these red lines, seemingly, with impunity. What options are left?
Well, I mean, after this recent nuclear test, I think the Chinese need to recognize more and more that this is not just an American problem, this is not just a Korean problem, it is their problem as well. And, I'd like to see them go along with sanctions to the extent that they're prepared to do that. But in addition to that, I think it is now time to talk seriously about finding new ways of getting back to the negotiating table. To my mind, the Chinese proposal on the table right now is a non-starter. They're suggesting that in exchange for a North Korean freeze on future nuclear activities, that we should cease all exercises with our South Korean ally. We're not going to do that. You don't have an alliance unless you exercise together. But there's got to be some middle ground. We ought to be able to find some way to come together on a process that gets us back to a productive negotiating table.
Ambassador, when it comes down to it, what's your gut feeling about whether President Trump would be willing to risk a potential nuclear attack on American cities on the mainland in order to defend Seoul? Because there's been, one school of thought saying that South Korea should perhaps start building up its own nuclear capabilities.
Well, we stand behind our ally, and we in no way want the South Koreans to build up their own military nuclear capability. But at the same time, no one wants war on the Korean Peninsula. No one is looking for a military solution. No one sees that as a positive prospect. So again, I get back to my point, is that we all need to be finding a way to continue to put pressure on North Korea.
Right.
North Korea is violating all kinds of international rulings and provisions, Security Council resolutions. But let's see if we can, while we apply these sanctions, let's look for some kind of roadmap that leads us back to negotiations.
And Tom, before we go, Nikki Haley said yesterday, and she's been quoted over and over again, these words, begging for war. That's what North Korea is doing, begging for war. Do you believe they're begging for war?
Well, my personal view is that this is a serious situation that should be addressed seriously and doesn't really call for colloquialisms. But I think the North Koreans are posing a real threat, and they have to know that as General Mattis has said, that if they attack us, they risk annihilation. But at the same time, we need to be finding a peaceful way forward, and I think we should be talking seriously about these serious issues.